Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for all of you for coming. I hope folks have had a chance to get who are with us today who are going to talk about some important items to consider when taking undergraduates abroad, and generally the 18 to 25 age set. We've got Laura Polk, who is the Institutional Equity and Title IX Coordinator and Assistant Legal Counsel, who's here today, who's going to talk about some Title IX issues. We have Susan Sasso. I'm grateful for having her join us again, the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs and Associate Dean of Students. Bet a lot of you know her. And also Nancy Connolly, who is Director of International Logistics and Risk Management and Staff Attorney. That's a new position that we started that we're really happy to have her here on campus, and she's been giving us some really great advice. She's one of about 22, 25 professionals around the country that hold a similar title, advising study abroad offices about what we need to do to be managing risk and keeping students safe. So our agenda today is we're going to go through the OU travel guidelines for sponsored student programs. That is available actually, all of you, everybody has a red folder? Yeah, did anybody not get a red folder? Okay, that's great. So that's going to be in there. We're going to be going over that. We're going to talk about some best practices and resources for managing risk and promoting student safety. We're going to get the perspective from Student Affairs about who our students are and what we can be doing to be practicing good social boundaries with our students. We're also going to be talking about the Clery Act and reporting duties. I don't know, has anybody heard of the Clery Act? Okay, so a couple people have heard of the Clery Act, but you will know all about what the Clery Act is and what responsibilities you have under that law as faculty and staff leaders by the time that we're done with this presentation. We're going to talk about the OU Emergency Response Protocol and what to do if things happen with your students while you're abroad that are of emergent nature. And then if we have some time at the end, in addition to questions and answers, we'll have a couple of scenarios that I have of things that have happened in the past to students and talk through how you guys might deal with some of these incidents that come up. Okay, so the International Travel Guidelines for all OU sponsored study abroad programs is in your folder. I believe it's a blue handout. This is also online. I'll just highlight some of the important parts of these guidelines is that there's a responsibility for all of you as faculty leaders to register your contact information with us and also to enroll in the insurance program that we have for the students. Now, the rationale behind requiring all of you as faculty leaders to enroll in the same insurance as the students is a security evacuation component. So that means that if there's a situation, there's some sort of emergency or disaster that happens in the country where you're leading students, as part of your duty of care to students, we want to have you on the same plane out as they are, okay? So that is why that's required. Now, for those of you who are bringing dependents, so that is spouses, domestic partners, and children, we can give you access to also the same level of insurance that you are going to have as faculty leaders, but instead of billing that to your departments, we just ask you to pay for that separately. And so Tina Henderson, who's here, is going to be somebody that you're probably all going to be in contact with for registering and going in the system and taking care of the insurance. We also ask that as faculty leaders, you work with your study abroad liaisons. Does everybody know who the study abroad liaison is in their college? Hopefully. Okay. Okay. It's Trish Ingram. Am I still recording? Okay, in your college, to make sure that all of the students are also registering in our system. And so sometimes we kind of have to play the heavy and the students say, oh, well, I don't really want to take care of this. This isn't important. So as faculty leaders, we ask for your collaboration and encouraging the students to complete all of the online submission requirements that they have as part of study abroad. We ask that all of you facilitate a pre-departure and an in-country orientation. So the pre-departure orientation should take place before you leave campus, before you go abroad. And then you should also have an in-country orientation. So shortly after you arrived in the country, you should have some sort of meeting with the students to orient them to their local surroundings. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the things you want to include in these orientations. For the pre-departure orientation, we advise you to articulate expectations around academics, emphasize this is an academic program, and so they are not on vacation or during a tour. That's something they can do on their own time. They're part of an academic program and they're being evaluated for that experience. That's definitely something we underscore in our office. It's a good idea to articulate expectations around attendance and time. And so particularly for those of you who are doing short-term programs, probably a lot of your meetings are part of your course contact hours that you're having. And so it's important to articulate beforehand to your students that attendance at these meetings or with the outside speakers or guests that you've brought in is a required part of the curriculum and is not optional. And in terms of time, you may have some students who are wanting to do evening activities. That's something that you can't entirely police, but what you can say is, okay, whatever you're doing or however late you're up at night, I need you here at 8 a.m. to get on the bus to go to this thing. And so articulating that beforehand, what your expectations are of showing up on time and in a coherent state for all of the meetings is going to be an important part of that pre-departure orientation. Field trip etiquette, I definitely think it's a good idea to talk to students about culturally appropriate ways of asking questions and also polite versions of doing requests in the host language. And so a lot of these are English language programs that are taking place in countries where English is not the primary language of instruction. But working with students to encourage them to know, please, thank you, I would like a glass of water, instead of just kind of pointing and saying want in the non-polite form, is going to earn them a lot of trust with their hosts and encourage an attitude that is really getting at the kind of intercultural communication skills that we're wanting to build in our students. Use of free time, I think it is good to articulate expectations around this. Again, it's not realistic to say that you can just, shut students in and lock the door after dusk falls and not expect them to be going out, but I think it is good to articulate some expectations around what is free time, what is class time, when are they on the clock with you as part of their course, and when are they not on that. And then general conduct, and we're going to go into that in a little more detail as well. For the pre-departure orientation, it's also important for you to discuss any risks that you know about the program. What we don't want is for a student to go on a study abroad program and say, you know what, I wouldn't have chosen to go on this study abroad program had I known the pollution was so bad in Beijing, for example, because I'm asthmatic and I didn't do that. Yes, it's the student's responsibility to be researching this too, but you have an increased responsibility as a faculty leader to be communicating known risks that you know. So physical environmental pollution would be an example of that. Political environmental risks, that would be questions of if there is, for example, protocol around taking pictures of military installations or police where you are. They might find it, particularly in Latin American countries, really interesting that there's so many young people with arms on them and want to take a picture of that, and in some countries that's really not a good thing to do. Transportation risks, if depending on the public transportation and taxi system in the countries where you're going, sometimes there's official and unofficial taxis, and maybe taking the official taxi is a smart way to go. There may be different levels of quality of bus services, and so there might be, you would advise them, for example, okay, if you're going to travel this weekend outside, I'd recommend you take this bus company and not take this bus company, because this bus company we know has a record of accidents and is not very reputable and kind of just picks up anybody on the road, stopping every 3 seconds to do that. And then personal safety and crime risks. Teaching your students about how to be savvy in a city is really important. We really emphasize this because a lot of OU students are from small towns. They're from towns of 100,000 or less. They've never been in a big city environment, and so they're used to making lots of direct eye contact and smiling with people and talking to friendly strangers and sharing lots of personal detail and information. And so you might just take for granted that, oh yeah, I act one way in Norman and I'm going to act a different way in particular neighborhoods or in a large urban environment, or when I get off the metro at a particularly crowded station in Paris. Don't assume that your students are going to know that either. So really emphasizing the city savvy part kind of at all points is very important. In your pre-departure orientation, I would encourage you to encourage your students to register in the STEP program. That's the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program. That's otherwise known as registering with the State Department. We have numerous links on our website to that, and we also give students information about that. You can go to travel.state.gov. That will put the students on a list to receive warden messages and consular information that comes out that embassies and consular officials know about. And it also means that they're on the list in case an evacuation needs to happen. They're accounted in the US citizens that are over there. And so that's not a required part except for travel warning countries, but definitely something we encourage. I'd encourage you to have your students complete an emergency information card. We have links to those on our websites, and they're nice little cards where they can fill in sort of what's my local 24/7 contact information, what's my 911 equivalent in this country, who can I call if this happens, and then also write down the 24/7 OU emergency number. We now have a cell phone that Nancy staffs actually 24/7, 7 days a week, so if an emergency happens, you can do that. But a good idea to write down kind of local emergency contact information on this. And then in the pre-departure orientation, I would also encourage you to have your students disclose issues that might potentially interfere with their successful participation in study abroad. So I'm thinking in particular here of like severe food allergies. So if you have a, maybe you could give them the example that if any of you are really seriously allergic to shellfish and you accidentally eat some, this is what I'm going to look like and I'll need to be rushed to the hospital. It's good in those students, of course, to carry an emergency bracelet. We address these in our videos, but it's good for you as faculty leaders also to create an environment where students feel free to disclose that information. Now, of course, there's a fine line you have to walk here. We do not keep student medical information on file. That's not the way it works at this university. And you also don't want to be giving medical advice to students. So bet most of you are doctors, but I bet most of you are not medical doctors. And you don't want to be in a situation where you say, well, I have lots of experience in country X, and I know that these are the shots to get, and this is what you're going to do, because then you're essentially giving medical advice without a license. What you want to encourage students to do is go to Goddard, meet with a travel nurse, go to the CDC website, research that information, and make decisions that they need to make in consultation with their physicians in terms of, medications that they're wanting to take abroad and all that sort of stuff. You should not be sharing medical information of students with parents without the explicit permission of the students. So things like FERPA, ADA, HIPAA, all these things that would apply here on campus apply while you're studying abroad or while you're taking the students abroad. And I think everybody here has already selected their group of students. Is that right? Okay, so one of the things, for future, if you do these again, is you don't want to discriminate on a student for selection based on information they've disclosed to you about needing accommodations. You want to talk to our office and see if it's possible to accommodate a student in that case. If you have information that causes you to question the student's potential for success abroad, please bring it to our attention. So basically, any red flags, or if you just get a sense from the student that you're not quite sure what's off, but you have a feeling that you might have some issues with the student, it's better to address that with our office before they get in the plane. I can't guarantee that we can do anything about it, and in very few cases are we going to prevent the student from getting on a plane, but just similar to how you're, with the behavioral observing that you're doing here on campuses, same thing kind of before they're going abroad. It's pre-departure orientation. If a red flag comes up for you, contact us. I would recommend that as faculty leaders you watch all of the pre-departure orientation videos that we have online. Some of them have pretty bad delivery. My staff tell me that I have a Blair Witch project going on for the safety and security video. The lights kept going off, the lighting is bad, and it's not the sexiest video, and we're working on redoing it, but the content, I think, is very valid and important. I'd particularly encourage you to watch the video on conduct, where we lay out very specific guidelines of conduct expectations and go through the student code and what the kind of different kinds of consequences that happen. The student code does apply while they're abroad, so any violations of a student code abroad, the same sort of disciplinary sanctions that could be brought against them here on campus apply abroad. Emergencies, the health abroad, getting ready, insurance, and then the messy but good in terms of the information it provides safety and security video. Your local orientation should provide information to students on landlines, cell phones, emails, street addresses for you and your local hosts. You should actually also know where the closest U.S. consulate is. And the reason that's important is not that any student has ever lost their passport abroad, but sometimes that might happen theoretically, and you would need to go to the consulate or perhaps to the embassy to get that passport replaced. We do encourage students to carry copies of the photo page of their ID passport on them, so that will facilitate them getting that. They've also registered that with our office. That's why we ask for the ID page of their passport, is because that's going to facilitate them getting a new passport in case for some reason it's lost or stolen. I'd encourage you also to designate an emergency meeting place with your students. And so if there's a earthquake that happens, or generally this is like a natural disaster scenario, have a meeting place A and a meeting place B, that in case communication is disabled, cell phone towers are down, landlines are not working, electricity's out, you have some place where you're all agreeing to meet and count for each other. And it's good to have maybe one is the central plaza, but if that is obstructed for some reason or obviously dangerous because it's on a fire or something, have a backup meeting place. You want to tell your students the nearest and preferred hospital, clinics, and pharmacies. That's something that your local hosts can help you do. Our Frontier Medics insurance plan also has a lot of information on this, and so as part of your registration, you'll receive a link where you can look up some of the closest hospitals and clinics that would be good for students. In some cases, your partners may have a university clinic right there on campus, which is helpful. And also designate a proxy leader in case you're incapacitated or you need to attend to the needs of an incapacitated student. And so that's basically your contingency planning for continuing programming and keeping the coursework going in case you're not able to do it because you have really severe traveler's diarrhea or whatever, or that you're needing to attend to a student who is in the hospital. Okay, it sounds silly, but this is what you want to think about, and you want to articulate this expectation in your local orientation. Okay, your local orientation, definitely guidelines to minimize known risk. Again, coming back to the city savvy thing about how they're carrying their cash, not necessarily carrying their backpack open with their earbuds in, distracted, hanging out, emphasizing situational awareness on students and some basic city smart activities. And if you want, I've gotten pretty good at the sex, drugs, and rock and roll talk, and if you want me to come give that spiel to your students, I'm happy to do that too. You want to articulate prohibited activities. And again, I'm thinking about taking pictures or entering areas where things that might not be intuitive to the student before they've gotten there. And you also want to articulate on your local orientation. You may have done this earlier, but articulate what the consequences of disciplinary violations are. And so my recommendation would be you start with a verbal warning. So, hey, Lucy, you didn't come to class this morning. Or you showed up an hour late and you look like you were really hungover. This is not acceptable behavior. You're interfering with the learning objectives of the group, and I need you as a participant in this learning community to be paying attention to the needs of the whole community and not just yourself. Can we agree that you're not going to do that again? Yes, okay, and then you make in your little diary a little notation of, okay, I talked to Lucy about the fact that she was hungover or late or something to class. And then the next thing you do is a written warning, and I would say copy in the Office of Education Abroad on that to kind of underscore the seriousness of what has just happened. And then dismissal obviously is a nuclear option, and if a student is really endangering themselves or others or completely interfering with your ability to successfully run a program, that's an option that you have, but it's not one that's used often. Understanding campus resources, you're not alone. You're going to be there, and the onus of responsibility is on you, but we are still here to assist you and to serve you at OU. Laura Polk, Susan Sasso, Nancy Connolly, myself, the advisors in our office, your campus liaisons are all here to help you out if you're needing assistance. But researching local resources is also really key. So know, is there a local police station that's good to contact? Maybe in the country where you're in, it's not the local police you want to contact, but the national police. Understand what local resources are going to be of use to you in case of an emergency situation. I keep harping on communicating expectations to students, but you just can't really assume, I don't want to say not assume common sense, but in a way you can assume common sense, particularly since they're going to be disoriented, they're out of their element, they're not in their comfort zone. They may just be stressed out and distracted and not making the same kind of decisions they're making in other environments. And so the more you can communicate your expectations, then you can refer back to them when they're not meeting them. But they won't know that if you don't tell them. Yeah, we have a 24/7 OU emergency response line. I think Nancy's going to talk more about that, and that is on the emergency response protocol that you have in your sheet. And so now local resources are going to be more important in the situation, but if an emergency does happen, as I'll talk about later, we want you to report that to our office. Our office has a file on each student that has a scanned copy of their passport ID page. They have all signed a personal conduct agreement and liability waiver. If you want to see the content of that, let me know. In the personal conduct agreement, they've agreed to comply with the OU School of Conduct, the OU Rights and Responsibilities, whatever the new name is for it, as well as all local applicable laws in the country where they are. We give the students a link to the insurance member page. That's where they'd go if they needed to file a claim. They have to log into the EA website first. They can't go directly to the insurance link to file a claim because it's a password protected. We're purchasing the insurance, we have a contract with them, and so you have to log into the EA website to get access to that. Also, really important, we ask students to register their local contact information after arrival. So after you get into country, maybe you can build into part of what you're doing a time for students to sit down at their computer and write down where it is that they're staying, different ways that we can reach them. We ask them if they have like a Twitter account or a Skype account or social media. The reason we ask for that is that those can be really effective ways, again, in terms of communication redundancy for communication in terms of an emergency. Okay, and I'm almost here to getting to Laura. I've lost track of time here a little bit. So just to note that so the perception of liability and negligence is highest for faculty-led programs. I say that because it might sound a little counterintuitive. You think, oh, well, it's actually reciprocal exchange programs are the riskiest kind of thing. And, but in terms of what our institutional responsibility is and what your responsibility is, the perception is that with faculty-led programs, you're controlling most of the aspects of this program. And so if something goes wrong, there's more responsibility on you because the assumption is that you've made a lot of decisions about how this is happening. There's evolving norms around in loco parentis. You probably know in the 50s we went from curfew, single-sex dorms, no allowing male visitors after a certain hour. In the 70s, there was sort of another swing towards everybody is a complete adult and we have, no interference in their lives. And we're kind of somewhere in the middle now is what I would say in terms of there is some in loco parentis expectation there. Yes, they're legally adults, but there is an assumption that you have a duty of care as a faculty leader. And negligence, basically, it's doing something which a reasonably prudent person would not do, or the failure to do something which a reasonably prudent person would do. So the failure to use ordinary or reasonable care. That's the standard that you are being held to. With that, how are we doing on time check? Does anybody have a... Okay, well, actually, we're fairly close to when we were having to schedule speak. Does anybody have any questions on what I did first, what I've gone through right now before we move on to Laura Polk?
Are you going to send us a copy of these?
Yes, I will send everybody a copy of this, as well as a link to the video that we're recording of this session for your future reference. Absolutely. Okay, good. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura. And...
so this fell off.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you guys for listening to me today. And I'm Laura Polk. I'm the Institutional Equity Officer. And I'm here to talk a little bit about sex. And we all know that that doesn't happen amongst our students. But in case it does, we're going to chat about all the ways in which we have an obligation to ensure that they have a good experience while they're abroad, and what your obligations are as faculty leaders with respect to this particularly sensitive topic. So you may be familiar with the Office of Civil Rights. They are the enforcement arm for the Department of Ed. And in 2011, they told colleges and universities that we were not doing enough with respect to gender discrimination. And part of that was the way in which we reacted to sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and general gender discrimination. And so they listed for us a variety of things that we needed to ensure that we did to come into compliance and to make sure that we had some policies and procedures that were effective for our students. Because a lot of people believe that although many of these things are also crimes, that the university couldn't do anything about it. And the exact opposite is true. Even though the things I'm about to describe may also be crimes, they're also administrative policy violations. So we have an obligation to have policies that address what the policy violations might be and their definitional terms, and ensure that we apply a process that's fair and equitable. And what the Office of Civil Rights told us was that what is fair and equitable in these types of administrative cases is to utilize basically a preponderance of the evidence standard. So whether or not somebody's violated our policy has a much, much lower burden of proof, meaning if we believe one person over the other just 50.1%, then we have a policy violation, versus the criminal justice system, which has basically beyond a reasonable doubt. So in many of these he said, she said type cases, we can take action as a university, whereas the criminal justice system won't even be able to file charges because it is so difficult to assess credibility when it's literally two people's word against one another. So we have these policies and provisions in place, and most of your students, hopefully all of them, have taken our online training, as hopefully you all have as well. And there are many forms of sexual misconduct. The first basic one is gender discrimination, and that is anybody taking an adverse action based on somebody's gender, whether that's male, female, or transgendered. So our policy does not just protect females. We have to remember it protects males as well, and that it protects gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation. So how does that apply to you? Well, that would mean that let's say you have a group of students together, and they begin harassing one another. And they make it really, really difficult for somebody, let's say somebody who happens to be gay, makes it really difficult for them to continue with the study abroad program. You as a faculty member actually have an obligation to stop the harassment, prevent its recurrence, and remediate the behavior. So a lot of times the things that we will see aren't necessarily a policy violation yet. It's not severe and pervasive. There hasn't been an adverse action, but you can see it coming. One or two texts calling them gay or faggot or something like that. Probably not yet a policy violation, because we actually have to have a little bit more than that, because people obviously have the right to freedom of expression, but at some point that crosses a line. And that's when we have to take action. But you can intervene before it gets that bad. So you can intervene and say, you know, while you're certainly entitled to your opinion, your behavior is starting to affect this other individual's ability to get an education here, and you are walking a fine line, and at some point I'm going to have to call the Title IX office and let them know of your behavior, and you might be kicked out of this program, and maybe even kicked out of the school, and you're not going to be coming back to the University of Oklahoma. And unfortunately, this month alone, we've had 7 cases in the span of 4 days. But they were based more on stalking and domestic violence, which we'll talk about in a second. But so your all's obligation is to stop the harassment, prevent its recurrence, and remediate the behavior. Sexual harassment, that's another major type of case that we see, and this is any sort of adverse action or the creation of a hostile environment by someone in a position of real or perceived authority over another that are either sexual in nature or gender specific, and it's severe and pervasive such that it affects an individual's ability to work, receive an education, or obtain any educational benefits. So a prime example is obviously a professor asking a female student out to dinner, kind of hitting on them, or vice versa, a female faculty member taking a male student out to dinner and hitting on them. All of those can result in a creation of a hostile environment or sexual harassment. It can also occur between students, gender-based harassment, like I said, calling names, hitting on somebody repetitively even after they've asked you to stop. All of those things can rise to the level of sexual harassment. A prime example of when you walk the fine line is the actual case that was the impetus behind the Office of Civil Rights letter, and that was at Yale University. There were a group of fraternity boys who held up signs that read, "No means yes and yes means anal." And so every time sorority girls would walk by to go to class, they had to see those signs. And the boys took it very seriously. They had shifts. So it wasn't just an hour a day during rush week. It was all day long, every day, for about an entire year. The females went to the administration and they said, "Please, could you do something about this?" Administration says, "Well, you know, those fraternity boys are on their own property. We don't own that property, and they have First Amendment protection." Office of Civil Rights said, "Absolutely not. Yes, people have First Amendment rights, but at some point they cross a line where it becomes severe and pervasive and objectively offensive such that it interferes with a person's ability to get their education." And in this example, those women actually had to circumvent those fraternity boys by walking an additional 20 minutes to get to class. In addition to the signs, the boys were heckling the women, basically rating them on the scale of 1 to 10 as they would walk by. So they said, "That's severe, that's pervasive, it's every day, and it's objectively offensive." It interfered with their education because they had to walk an additional 20 minutes to avoid it. And you, university, you have control over those fraternity boys. Yes, they're on their own property, but they're your students, and you can and should do something about it. So that was the impetus behind the Office of Civil Rights letter, and it's an example of a form of sexual harassment. So sexual violence. Yes, these are crimes, but they're also policy violations. And again, our standard of proof is much, much lower. And a lot of the issues are not your standard belief that somebody has to be tied up and thrown in the back of a car and raped in that fashion. There are many forms of sexual misconduct that we are educating our students on, so they should be really familiar with this, but as you can imagine, they're impulsive and they might get alcohol when they're studying abroad because the age limit is much different than ours, and that's the prime type of case that we see are these cases of incapacity, and where one person is too incapacitated to actually give consent. By law, legally, you cannot give consent when you are incapacitated by drugs, medication, or alcohol. And there's a difference between drunk sex and incapacitated sex, and it's a fine line. Basically, there are certain factors that you have to consider, and that is, how much did the person have to drink? If you're 5 feet tall, weigh 100 pounds, and you've had 10 shots of vodka, high likelihood that you're going to be fairly incapacitated. You're going to stumble when you walk. You're going to slur your speech. You might be in and out of consciousness. You might be throwing up. All of those factors, if you have those types of factors, mean that the person was too incapacitated to consent. Does that mean that you have an automatic violation of the policy? Probably. But let's say that it is not two of your students. The victim is your student. The perpetrator is a student from another college or university, also present on this campus. So I'm going to give Oxford as an example. So you've got Oxford students, and they go to the pub one night, and the female gets completely intoxicated, and a true Oxford student is there. They go back to his room, things ensue, and the next day she realizes, I have no recollection of what happened last night. And everybody saw her, knew that she was completely trashed, and knew that she was probably incapacitated. At that point, you have a policy violation. You have no technical control over the alleged perpetrator. He's not our student, but he's at a program where we are sending our students. We have an obligation to stop the harassment, prevent its recurrence, and remediate the behavior. So what does that mean? That means we have an obligation to that victim. We need to get her some counseling. You would call the emergency hotline. You would reach out to them, find out what insurance covers, what are some of the counselors that are available, possibly allow her to come home, possibly, refund her money, all of those things. Or if she wants to stay there, make sure that she is removed from the situation where you have this alleged perpetrator, which would probably include going to the local police, whether or not they could do anything. Again, he said, she said, in almost every jurisdiction that's going to be a hard case to prove. But Oxford probably has some sort of counterpart to me that you can go to, and they would do and conduct a similar investigation where somehow we need to remove that gentleman, or not so much of a gentleman, from that situation and ensure that our victim is not continuing to be harassed. So there are a variety of things that we can do with your assistance to make sure that everything happens in a smooth fashion. And again, I'm using females as examples, and that doesn't mean that men can't also be violated. And obviously, cases of same-sex incidents are also covered by our policy. Sexual exploitation, unfortunately, this is another common example of the types of things that we see. The advent of iPhones, people like to put them in curious places, like potted plants in restrooms so they can see folks changing clothes, using the bathroom, that sort of thing, and then taking that video and uploading it to some lovely website. So those are also violations of our policy. Sexual orientations, like I said earlier, the belief that someone is or is not gay, the belief that somebody's too effeminate for a man or too masculine for a woman, all of those can result in a claim for sexual orientation depending upon what sort of action is taken based on that belief. Are you excluding them from something? Are you refusing to hire them? Are you refusing to allow them to come on this trip? All of those can be a basis for a claim under sexual orientation discrimination. So when do you report a policy violation? The moment a student comes to you and describes to you something that violates our policy, we need you to contact at least Nancy's shop, Alice's shop, who will probably then in turn contact us, or you can contact us directly. We also have a sexual assault response team whose phones are answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's on our website as well. They can provide all sorts of assistance. So let's say a student comes to you and is unsure whether he or she actually wants to report this to the university. A lot of the time we see victims who are reluctant. They don't want to come forward, but they need some sort of help. They need to be transferred from their housing, or they need counseling services, or they just want to come home. Any of those things you can help them with on the front end without learning the specifics of the incident. But if the victim tells you enough facts to where you know you have a problem and you have a policy violation, and maybe it's amongst students, amongst themselves, and you've got to protect the community, then you do need to let us know. So it's important for you to advise your students in your orientation that depending upon what they tell you, you might be obligated to in turn tell someone else who can help them. So they have to be very careful if they haven't decided yet whether they want to fully come forward. So at the beginning of the conversation, you need to assess, are they just seeking help for counseling or something like that? Or do we want to ensure that they come through our policy and procedures? Because even though we are a kindler and gentler avenue for folks in the criminal justice system, it is still very stressful. Because you still have to tell your story to more than one person, and that's embarrassing, obviously. And the alleged perpetrator has certain due process rights to basically challenge you on your allegations. And there's a right to a hearing. And a hearing process, even though it's administrative and much less stressful than the criminal justice system, it's still a hearing. It's still embarrassing. You still have hearing panel members who have to hear it. But we want them to know that we are there to support them all the way through it, and we will help them as much as we can. But again, it's up to a victim to ensure that they have power and control over how they want this to go. Do they want to report it? We're there for them. Do they just need services? We're there for them in that manner as well. So where can you report? Like I said, we have a sexual misconduct office, and we also have Alice's shop or Nancy's shop to contact. And then also you want to encourage them to go to local police and allow them to assist them as well. So again, like I said, if the person is unsure whether or not they come forward, you need to ensure that you've told them that depending upon what they're about to tell you, you may have to in turn around and report it to someone else. So just ensure that they understand that. Can you be held liable for failing to report? Yes, unfortunately. A lot of these alleged perpetrators have a recidivism rate of at least 6 times in their college career. So this particular victim doesn't choose to come forward. There's a high likelihood that there's a victim number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so we have to also protect all of those victims as well. So that's why Title IX has indicated that employees of universities are obligated to report. What happens after a report is made? Once you do an official report, our office has to commence an investigation within 10 days. It's pretty fast. And we have to do it regardless of whether or not the person has gone through the criminal justice system. We want to make sure we don't interfere with a police investigation, obviously. And we have a great working relationship with OUPD and Norman PD. We don't know the police forces abroad, obviously, and they're probably not going to be as happy with us interfering with their police investigation either. But we do at least have to take the statement of the victim and start showing a progress towards some sort of investigation. We have to wrap up everything, the investigation, the disciplinary action through student conduct, and this is Steve Ashmore, your Director of Student Conduct, by the way, through the Office of Student Conduct, where we would hold any sort of hearings and mete out any sort of sanctions. That all has to be wrapped up within 60 days. So we have a very short time frame, much, much shorter than any sort of police investigation. So after you've made the report, we have conducted the investigation by talking to the victim and the alleged perpetrator, any witnesses, gathered any sort of technical evidence like text messages, Facebook postings, those sorts of things. We issue a report, send it through student conduct, then that's where the sanctions are meted out, and we either enter into some sort of arrangement, an agreed suspension or counseling or expulsion, or we have to actually go through a hearing where it's like a mini trial in a court system to have a panel basically mete out those sanctions. We have loads of FAQs, policies and procedures, scenarios on our website. We also absolutely have a section on FAQs for students, and there's a section for international students underneath where students coming here, we have some tips and advice, and students going there, we have tips, advice, and some links on that website as well. So I encourage you all to look at that and let us know if we can ever be of assistance, and I hope never to hear from you. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much,
Thank
Laura.
you.
I really appreciate it. Okay.
And if you guys are feeling like you're needing a break, maybe after Susan's talk, we can check in, and if folks are feeling like they need 5 minutes, we'll do it at that point. Okay.
So I'm going to get the eyeball floaters. Is that it at this point?
Unless you want to give it to him now, Susan.
Okay. Vote. Who wants a break now? Okay. So no floating eyeballs. That's our deal then, okay? Well, I can't decide if I drew the short straw that I get wedged between the two powerhouse attorneys. Or maybe they just thought you needed a break because what I'm talking about is a little lighter. We're going to assume that's it. So thanks for being here. I know it's a Friday and you're incredibly busy, and so I appreciate you taking the time to come. What you're doing is making a profound difference in the lives of the students that go with you, and it's one of my great regrets that I did not study abroad when I was in school, and I tell every student, it's not a question of if, it's when are you doing this. So I appreciate it. I have a handout for you, which you can pick up. If you're interested in all the different areas and the individual contact people that are in student affairs, that's available for you, and it's there. The other thing I brought you today are 2 contact cards. One is a little plastic card we did. It's the 411 at OU, which might be handy when you're abroad with a lot of the different contact numbers of different offices. So those will be here at the front that you can grab those when you come out as well. Here's my question for you today. I'm a Mac person, so this is going to be interesting. Tell me what I push.
Oh, sorry. Yep, it's these arrows here.
Got it. All right, cool.
And I think we might need to just go here and then.
Awesome. All right, this is my question. Do you know who is traveling with you? And I'm going to speculate that you may not know as well as you think you do. And I'm going to really focus my comments on that, is giving you sort of a look, a snapshot of what our student body looks like. Good news is our students are smart, some exceptionally so. That might not be a bad idea because I get distracted really easily. 57% are in very good or excellent health. So they're smart and most of them are healthy. 90% describe themselves as being in good, very good, or excellent health. This is based on a survey we do, and it's a national survey of college students that most major campuses do every year. And 27% report that they have not used alcohol at all in the last 30 days, which there's some comfort in that, as you well know, because that doesn't describe all of our students. Here's the challenge. And I think, we don't have problems at OU. We just have challenges and opportunities. So the challenge is that many of these students you travel with are facing some pretty serious life issues, and that's what I want to make you aware of today. Not to scare you off. Last year, I don't think anybody changed their mind after this, so that's the good news. We could, yeah. 26% report that they suffer from anxiety to an extent, and all of these are to the extent that it impacted their academic performance in the last 12 months. So to put that in context, 90% suffer from depression, 29% from sleep difficulties, 13% from stress, 12% have seriously considered suicide, and I have to believe that number is going up because in the other hat I wear as the chair of our behavior intervention team, that seems to be, my girlfriend broke up with me, I'm going to kill myself. I flunked a test, I'm going to kill myself. I mean, that has become just a common thread within our student body. And 2% have actually attempted suicide, and I can vouch for that as well. Those are pretty serious numbers. 80% report that they have taken non-prescribed prescription drugs, which, what do you think is the drug of choice now? Adderall, absolutely, yeah, Adderall. And 30%, 27% don't drink at all, 30% report that they binge drink. So we've got another third approximately that probably consume alcohol on a normal level. And of those who report drinking, 24% have reported having unprotected sex. I hate to take the thunder out of Laura that they are having sex. 19% have physically injured themselves while they were drinking. And 3.5% had sex with someone admittedly when that other person had not given consent. That's concerning. The next slide looks at the fact that overall about 63% report that they are sexually active, and only 48% reported using contraception when they engaged in vaginal intercourse. So some of them may come back with really special souvenirs from their study abroad. And it has happened, yes. And of those who report drinking, wait a minute, that got in there twice, sorry. The other issue to think about related to some of Laura's issues, 90% identify as heterosexual, and this is pretty typical with the population as a whole. 9% identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and 3% are unsure of their sexual orientation. That's something that sometimes gets explored when they study abroad. So again, just things that you need to be aware of. So who cares? That's, I guess, the real question. Why should that matter to you? Two reasons. I think it's really important that you leave here understanding the complexity of our student body and that the kind of issues that are traveling with you, and that sometimes these issues are amped up a little bit when you study abroad. Often the living situation's a little more closer, a little tighter quarters. You're spending a lot of intense time with the same people day in and day out, and that can cause all of these issues to surface a little bit more. This is my definition because I'm not the lawyer. Nancy and Laura probably can tell you something maybe a little more technical than that. But it's pretty much, and that's the expectation. And they're going to look at you as mom and dad, not Dave. And then the good news on top of that is, you can click to the next one. Their parents, all have this helicopter propeller out of their head. These are students who literally are calling their parents 2 and 3 and 4 times a day. And I think that's changed the whole study abroad experience because of that. It's not quite as convenient. Now, some of them, their parents will hand them an international phone that they can still do that, but certainly not all of them. And all of a sudden, they're looking to you for what they may have been getting from their parents in the past. And some of that may be just wonderful, and some of it may be just not so wonderful. Here's where I think it becomes really important to think about it, is to set those expectations early. And I made a note that those pre-departure and in-country orientations you were talking about are so incredibly important. I would set as a bare minimum that student code of rights and responsibilities, which you have. And if you didn't work with the old one, you should be really grateful that it's now like 6 pages, because it used to be 26 pages. So it's a lot easier to break down in terms of what those expectations are. And I think your points on what is a minor infraction and working through that sort of discipline level with them. The first time's the conversation, the next time is that written warning, and the third time is the nuclear option. And I've dealt with people who kind of ignored stages 1 and 2, never told the student what you're doing is inappropriate and wanted to send them home. It's not fair and it's not realistic. And that probably means other people in the program continued to suffer from their behavior when you skip stages 1 and 2. Again, I think you need to adjust that code of responsibilities. That is sort of the baseline. And then there may be issues that you need to add depending on where you're taking them and what the program is. So it's important to consider all of those. And I know Alice and Nancy will be wonderful at helping you adapt those. And then the other thing I want to talk about is setting social boundaries. Some of these students, again, because of the relationship they've had with family and friends, aren't as good at knowing where to cross a boundary. And some of them will attach to you, quite literally, and may wear you out. But I think it's important for you to kind of set some boundaries early on as to what you're comfortable with and what you're not. These are emotional students. You know that. You work with them. Probably, if I can remember being that age, I think all of you can. It's just a different time in our lives.